The submitted current event papers for this class have been graded. There's some feedback that I want to provide you as well. I haven't got a chance to post that for everyone, but the grades are there now, and I'll be giving you sort of a sheet that I utilize to sort of check off the key items of your current event papers. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we wrap things up today. Okay, by my clock, it is now 1:15. Let's go ahead and start the April 20th session of our course here. And as normal at this time, let's do a check-in. Please type present for your attendance in chat. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. Outstanding. Okay, so as we've done so far this semester, we have begun each section with a review of what we covered last, be it a test, exam, or we went through a regular type of lecture. And we'll do the same thing here, looking at our last session, which was the focus of personality. Personality was the focus. We talked about traits. A trait is an enduring quality that makes a person tend to act a certain way. We then talked about trait theory of personality, which basically says we are made up of a collection of traits, these behavioral predispositions that can be identified and measured, and these traits differ from one person to another. So your best male friend, close friend, has one set of personality traits, and your best female friend has another set of personality traits. They're different from each other. Then we talked about measuring traits. We can look at projective tests, which would be used for something like Freud's approach to personality, but there are many issues with those types of tests. We talk about measuring traits using such things as factor analysis like the Eisniks did, and they found that many personality traits are a function of two basic dimensions along which we all vary, and that would be stability, stable versus unstable, and introverted versus extroverted. Then we talk about such things as a personality inventory. These are questionnaires assessing many personality traits by asking which behaviors and responses a person would choose to make. Empirically derived tests, all the test items have been selected because they predictably match with qualities being assessed, so they have a certain degree of validity. We also mentioned the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And this is designed to identify people with personality difficulties. And it's a series of true-false questions, and the items were selected because they're correlated with various traits, emotions, and attitudes. We also talked about the big five. This is conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, those types of things that go on. When we look at research that's been done in the area of traits, we tend to see these big five traits always there. We also talk about whether or not traits can be stable or not. Do we change over time? And so we look at issues of stability, how well they can predict future behaviors, and also heritability. Are our traits something that we inherit? Okay, is our personality totally something that's genetically based or based also on our experiences? We also looked at the person situation controversy. The person situation controversy basically is this: you have one person, and in one situation they behave one way, but take them into a totally different situation, they behave in a different way. The idea is that means that it's stable or not. Well, it may not be stable across situations, but within situations. For example, if you go to your church, you behave a certain way. But if you go to someone else's church, you may behave the same way compared to when you go to a party, you're going to behave a totally different way. So the situation sort of dictates which person we get. All right. And then we looked at social cognitive perspective offered by Bandura and others, basically saying that we cannot ignore social factors when it comes to our personality, that consistent way that we behave, think, and feel, because it does play a role based on such things as reciprocal determinism, the idea that the person, the internal characteristics of a person, their environment, and their behaviors all influence each other, a bunch of bi-directional arrows, focusing on each one of those concepts: the internal person, the environment, and then behaviors. You like doing this type of behavior, therefore you have friends that do those types of things. And we don't know chicken or the egg, Which started which? Do you have these friends because of the things that you like, or do you like these things because of the type of friends that you have? That's the idea of reciprocal determinism. And then we looked at such things as self-views, the importance of the self, the ideal self, the actual self, the spotlight effect, and things such as the self-serving bias. So that sort of rounded out what we talked about during our last session. Okay, let's get to this session, psychological disorders. So where we are in the course, by the way, is we're nearing the end, as we all can feel the excitement of that happening. So we have chapter 14 that will wrap up this particular unit, unit number 5, and then we begin unit 6 the next week. Well, we'll have chapter 15 on therapy, and then also appendix B, the psychology at work. I'll also include, as a little bit of a bonus and extra credit, a module that I'll have recorded on forensic psychology. Okay, so psychological disorders. What we'll seek to understand is, what does it mean to have a mental disorder? Defining and classifying these disorders, such as anxiety, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and then a sample of other disorders like dissociative, eating disorders, and personality disorders. And then finally, looking at the rates of these diagnoses. How prevalent are these particular types of disorders in our society? So first, we start off with, what is a psychological disorder? So we'll see this a couple of times, but a psychological disorders, a syndrome marked by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, the way they think, emotion, the way they feel, okay, how they can control their feelings, and behavior, how they act. It's dysfunctional or maladaptive, and often accompanied by some form of distress. So the reasons why we are very interested in psychological disorders and want to learn about them could be personal familiarity with psychological symptoms, knowing someone else with the disorder, hearing about how prevalent and socially devastating some disorders have become in society, and wanting to learn more about mental health and human nature. So these are all the variety of reasons why it is that people are interested in this. And of course, most oftentimes, and some of you may experience this as well, often when people take a psychology course, they feel like maybe they have some of the issues going on there, or they can relate to them. It's not unusual, because we are all humans, and we do have and do experience some issues, and sometimes these questions do come up. So let's look at a few perspectives of psychological disorders. Defining psychological disorders, thinking about critically about ADHD, understanding them, classifying those disorders, and labeling psychological disorders. And then insanity and responsibility will be some of the topics that we'll cover in a few upcoming sections here. Questions to keep in mind: how do we decide when a set of symptoms are severe enough to be called a disorder that needs some sort of treatment? Can we define specific disorders clearly enough so that we can know that we're all referring to the same behavior or mental state? And can we use our diagnostic labels to guide treatment rather than stigmatize people? These are some very significant questions that researchers and clinicians have always thought about. So again, what is a psychological disorder? A significant dysfunction in an individual's cognitions and emotions. All right. Now, the term disorder is used instead of disease. And I want to specify why that is. The latter term, disease, typically implies a known cause of the symptom. So when you see disease, that's implying that we know the cause of the symptoms. And naming a disorder, you're not naming a cause such as a virus. Instead, you're naming a collection of symptoms that tend to go together. So I just want to specify why it is that we don't see disease, and here we see disorder. Disease, we have a lot more knowledge of, and we know the cause. So disorders are diagnosed when there is a dysfunction, behaviors which are considered maladaptive because they interfere with one's daily life. Disorders are diagnosed when the symptoms and behaviors are accompanied by distress or suffering. Now, in the new definition of DSM-5, which has been out for a while now, a disturbance in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. So what we see here is several characteristics that are normally going to be in place before you refer to something as a disorder. First of all, it has to be something that is interfering with one's daily life potentially, okay, or it's causing the person some distress or suffering. So it could be a scenario in which it's not really interfering in one's life, but it causes you a great deal of distress or suffering internally. And that still can be a disorder. It's just not interfering with your life as of yet. Anybody need any clarification on that or comment? I'll pause for a second as I take a sip of coffee. Okay, seems like we're all good. So let's talk about something that we've all heard of before, and that is going to be ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay, now we've all heard of that. It's impulsivity mixed with inattention and or hyperactivity. It can include distractibility, disorganization, fidgeting, difficulty suppressing impulses, and impaired working memory. And the question we have, is this a disorder? That's the question. We have all this type of stuff. And some of this stuff, to some extent, to some degree, could probably be normal with some people, especially young people, as they're developing and maturing. Okay, they're fidgety, they may be bored, they may easily get distracted. But when is it a disorder? So is this a disorder? Definitely yes. Is it deviant? Do some people have a level of inattentiveness, impulsiveness, or restlessness that goes beyond laziness or immaturity? That's the question. Is it distressful? Is the person enjoying being energetic, or are they frustrated that they can't sustain focus? So this is a key thing. And one of the reasons why we'll see how people think about ADHD today. Is there a dysfunction? Are the symptoms harmless fun, or do they negatively impact work and relationships? Okay, to answer all three questions is yes. For some people, ADHD is a disorder, deviating greatly from the norm and causing significant distress and dysfunction. Now, ADHD is overdiagnosed when the label is applied to children whose behavior may be a function of immaturity, culture, sleep deprivation, or other learning problems. And ADHD may be underdiagnosed, most frequently in girls with the primarily inattentive type of ADHD, when children are quietly trying to sustain focus but can't do it. So ADHD has been around for some time. Many of you may have been diagnosed with it. Many of you are probably surely aware of people who have it. Is there a question?
Yes, I had a question. I was looking on a study about this, and there's a large percentage of children from birth until a year of age that are being prescribed medicine for this affliction. I was extremely surprised by this, and I wanted to know, like, is there some validity to that?
Normally I would say that, and now this is not my specific area of expertise, but that has been one of the major controversies, is the prescribing of medications that are basically mind altering in an extent to people who are so young. I've not heard of it being that young before, but definitely it has been an issue because these drugs, we necessarily don't know the long-term effects of them, but people have debated the legitimacy not only of the diagnosis but also of the course of treatment, and it still goes on today. But obviously I would suggest or state that you probably feel a little bit weird by that discovery as well. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And so that's where a lot of professionals are. We're not quite sure, because basically when we describe ADHD, and most ADHD diagnoses are with males, children,
Yeah.
and boys are that way almost innately. So we see that there's some of it. The question is this just boys being boys, or are we just seeing something that may be a little bit overdiagnosed? And there, it may be somewhere in the middle road of all of that, but it is something that still remains a controversy. Because we are prescribing quite a bit of drugs out there. And that's part of our society as well. We're more likely to seek a CVS pharmacy solution than a more behavioral management solution, which there are some out there. But again, one of the issues is uh, you could use behavioral modification techniques for some children, but you have to get everyone who's involved in that child that has contact with that child on a regular basis to participate. And that'll be harder to do than just going to CVS and getting the prescription. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah.
So that's part
Convenience
of the
is
issue
what we
too.
buy.
Yeah. So the idea is that this still remains quite a bit of a controversy. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies out there, they have their own dog in the race, so to speak, because they make a lot of money from it. So
Yeah.
there are lots of issues going on there. We can't look at this stuff in an isolation. But yes, a good point you bring up. There are some serious concerns out there, most definitely. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. So one of the issues that we also see as well is how it is that we view psychological disorder. And there's a certain type of stigma associated with it to some extent, obviously. So in the past, uh, one reason to diagnose a disorder is to make decisions about treating the problem. All right, so we have this particular issue, and this is how we're going to treat it. Based on older understanding of psychological disorders, treatments have included exorcising evil spirits, beatings, caging, restraint, and trephination, which is basically drilling a hole in the skull of the afflicted person. The idea was that if you drill the hole, then you can allow what evil spirits or other things that may be going on there to ability to get out and escape the person's skull. So this is one of the ways in which it was treated in the past. But then we saw Pinel's new approach. Philippe Pinel proposed that mental disorders were not caused by demonic possession, but by stress and inhumane conditions. Pinel's moral treatment involved gentleness, nature, and social interaction. Now, it didn't do much to really solve the issue, whatever disorder the person may be going through, but at least it gave us a different type of perspective on how to treat people who may have some psychological disorder. They weren't called psychological disorders at the time. They were deemed crazy or lunatics, and they would be put into places like asylums. And these asylums back in those days were definitely not a place you would want to be in or be involved in. Usually it just involved caging or restraining the person for days on days and hours on hours in a day just to control and contain them. And so, and also it's very sad, but at times the people who are the aristocracy or the well-off individuals of the day, they would visit some of these asylums as if they were going on tours to a zoo to see the crazy people. So it took some time, but Pinel's intervention improved lives, but often did not effectively treat mental illness. So lives were improved by Pinel's approach, but it was not about treating the illness itself. But then we saw a slight different change here. The discovery that the disease of syphilis caused mental symptoms by infecting the brain. So this was a major leap forward when they discovered that you could have something physical, something biological that could cause a mental illness. So what this did is sort of suggested a medical model of mental illness. So now they knew there was something that was truly a medical issue that could cause a mental illness issue. So this suggested what they refer to as the medical model. All right. And so this medical model, what we have is the psychological disorders can be seen as psychopathology, an illness of the mind. So the medical model is seeing it as an illness for the first time of the mind, not evil or demonic spirits. All right. So disorders can be diagnosed, labeled as a collection of symptoms that tend to go together. So the medical model also implies ideas about etiology or the cause of mental disorder. It is not always possible to determine the cause of a specific mental disorder, but in general, the assumptions here is that cause is physical and mental and not spiritual. So people with disorders can be treated, attended to, given therapy, all with the goal of restoring mental health. So that is what the medical model brought us. It's sort of a different perspective of how we can sort of view the disorder and what we can do about the disorder. So the taint of demonic possession or evil spirits is no longer there. Now we have someone who is ill, okay, not due to them being unclean individuals necessarily here, but they're ill because there is something that could be wrong with them physically that's causing the mental illness. And so this was a major leap forward in trying to figure out how and what we can view the psychological disorders as. So now we have something that can be done, not in the area of religion necessarily or spiritualism, but in the area of, quote, science. So what we see here when it comes to psychological disorder, we can look again at this biopsychosocial approach that we've seen several times during this course. Anything that we have come across, we can look at it from these perspectives. The biological, evolution, individual genes, brain structure, and chemistry all play a role, as we will see as we continue our conversation here, on the psychological disorder, as well as psychological influences of stress, trauma, learned helplessness, mood-related perceptions, and so on, affecting it, as well as social cultural influences, roles, expectations, definitions of what normal is and what is a disorder. So culturally, we'll see that this is a big thing too, that there are cultural influences on disorders, believe it or not. Cultural influences on disorders. For example, we have these culture-bound syndromes. These are disorders which only seem to exist within certain cultures. They demonstrate how culture can play a role in both causing and defining a disorder. Now, we've talked about culture several times in this course already. And at one point, we talked about culture dictates what are the norms, what are the normal types of things that go on within it. So if it dictates what are the norms or the normal types of things going on, it also dictates what are the abnorms, the abnormal types of things. So here we see some examples of some disorders which are culturally bound. All right. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these as we go, at least the first one as we go on. Examples are bulimia nervosa, which is a binging purging disorder that we tend to see in the United States and cultures like ours here in the United States. Then we have running amok, violent outbursts. We see this in Malaysia. Hikikomori, social withdrawal. We see this in Japan. So each of these cultures have certain types of disorders that seem to be bound to their particular culture. So interestingly enough, as we see the bulimia nervosa, our culture has a lot to do with food. We have great access to food. Food is something that we usually don't worry about on a day-to-day basis here. We usually have access to it, no problem. And it's those types of cultures that easy access to food and the great reliance on media, as we are here in our particular country and this type of culture that we have, that's where we tend to see bulimia nervosa within a certain populations in a culture like ours. All right, so just a note here that we see certain specific type of culture-bound syndromes, but also note this, there seems to be some disorders which are universal, such as schizophrenia, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and depression, which we've mentioned a couple of times, but we will go over it again in more detail here. So classifying disorders and responsibility. Why create classifications of mental illness? What is the value of talking about diagnosis instead of just talking about individuals? One, diagnoses create a verbal shorthand for referring to a list of associated symptoms. All right, because you want to know what symptoms are associated with a particular type of diagnosis. And this will be very beneficial to healthcare, in particular mental health care professionals. Diagnoses allow us to statistically study many similar cases, learning to predict outcomes. So we have these types of diagnoses, these symptoms, and allows us to try to see how often these symptoms are occurring together and in what populations. Diagnosis can guide treatment choices. So as you know what the diagnosis is, and you know what the symptoms are associated with this diagnosis, you can sort of run the numbers to see how people are treating it and how successful have this particular course of treatment been, and how successful or unsuccessful this other course of treatment has been. So you now have diagnoses, and you also have treatment choices out there. That's why classifying psychological disorders is important. Now, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a resource that mental health care professionals have in order to do that exact type of thing. It's easier to count cases of autism if we have a clear definition. And the DSM is where we provide clear definitions of these particular types of disorders. The DSM is used for justifying payment for treatment for healthcare. It is consistent with other diagnoses used by medical doctors worldwide. For example, the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases and the DSM-5, that's the volume we're on now, would be aligned with each other, so that not only doctors who are in our particular culture, cultures like ours, but doctors around the world are talking with a common language, a common shorthand, so we can help diagnose, do the research, as well as treat, and how successful those particular treatments have been. This is what this does for us. Now, looking a little bit more closely at the way the DSM is sort of structured, the DSM suggests describing someone not just as a label, but with a 5-part picture. So they'll talk about, is it a clinical syndrome present? Axis 1. Axis 2 is a personality disorder or mental retardation, also now referred to as intellectual development disorder, present. Axis 3 is a general medical condition such as diabetes, arthritis, or hypertension, present. Axis 4 are psychosocial or environmental problems such as school or housing issues, also present. So they're looking at everything you possibly can look at that may be a cause or influence into someone's behavior. And Axis 5, what is the global assessment of this person's functioning? Clinicians assign a code of from 0 to 100. Now, I've not really used this, but the idea is that this source, the DSM, gives you a really good picture by asking the right questions and collecting the right data. Therefore, by doing this type of work up front, it allows for the proper diagnosing of individuals that then can be put into the full knowledge base, so that when you go to a mental health care professional and you've been with them and you've shared with them the symptoms, they can aid in diagnosing that person properly and know what the research and courses of treatment are out there based on all the data that has been collected. So the categories of diagnosis here, just looking at a few of these bullet points here, disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, child, or adolescence, as the mental disorders due to general medication. So again, asking these questions that we were talking about earlier. So the axis 1 is the clinical syndrome present, and then asking all these types of things. And so we get some sort of clearer idea of what the diagnosis may be. So now when it comes to the DSM, there are always going to be critics because no one tool is perfect at all. But here are some of the changes. If you are familiar with the previous DSM in personal reading or in other classes, the DSM-5, autism and Asperger's syndrome is now the autism spectrum disorder. Mental retardation is now referred to as intellectual disability. we do have the inclusion of hoarding disorder and binge eating disorder added. And of course, has anyone ever seen those TV shows that involve someone who is a hoarder? But just say yes, or send me a chat if you've seen a show about hoarders before.
Yes.
Okay, so you can see once it makes it to a show like that, is part of the common knowledge base that this disorder does exist. And so I'm not sure if the TV show came first or the change in the diagnosis here or adding it came later or not. But the idea is that hoarding disorder is something that we see, and so we know it is a disorder. It's my wife watches these shows sometimes, and I come in and see them on TV, and it's really sad how people can let those types of things happen with whatever the hoarding is fulfilling for them in their life. And of course, binge eating disorder. Now, there are some criticisms to the DSM, as well as criticisms for all these types of tools to some extent. There's a wider net, this wider net that the DSM-5 pathologizes everyday life. It is too broad. So basically what they're saying is the way it is designed, everyone potentially has some sort of disorder. And then the other criticism is that these are subjective diagnostic labels, meaning that there's really no objective way to say there's somewhat of a subjective nature to them. And then we have biasing power of labels. And you may be aware of this. When someone puts a label on someone, it is very hard to take that label off. I mean, you could just be the student, for example, that goes to school, a new school, and some teacher labels you. Let's say this is elementary school. Some teacher labels you as a difficult child. It will be very difficult, near impossible, if that does go around to other teachers, to remove that label. Does that make sense? Does anybody understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have a child, or if you're the one, a label once affixed to someone can be very, very difficult to remove. In fact, there was a study that was done years ago, I think it was by Rosenhan, I believe, where he got some individuals trained to go to a institute, a mental healthcare institute, and have themselves admitted based on X type of symptoms. And when they got there, they were supposed to stop all the symptoms and immediately say everything's normal, everything's going fine. But despite the fact that they did that, they still were seen as whatever they were diagnosed as when they were in intake. So it was hard for them to get past the label at these particular places. So the label does have a lot of power. And that's what that item number 3 is about. It's about biasing power of labels, that once you have it, it is there. It is difficult to remove it. So many people think diagnostic label means being seen as tainted, weak, or weird even. However, these negative views and stigma come from popular culture views of mental illness and not from the DSM. So the DSM would say, this is not because of us, it's because of popular culture. And I will have to state there is a lot of support for that. So the DSM may contain the information to correct inaccurate perceptions of mental illness. If you watch any of the TV shows like Law and Order or CSI, you know, a lot of our shows, the most popular shows, are about crime. And oftentimes, in Law and Order is the one that I'm familiar with, when they would have somebody who had a mental disorder, they were normally portrayed as being very, very violent. This is not to say that doesn't happen. But the research out there, and this is, I mean, it's weird to say even now with all the violence that's been going on lately, but the research, when you look at the numbers, basically says that a person who has a psychological disorder is more likely to be the victim of a crime than to be the perpetrator of the crime. And normally, as we'll see shortly here, that normally when someone is going to be a perpetrator of a crime who has some sort of psychological disorder, usually it's going to be involving some sort of comorbidity, which means that they have several disorders going on at the same time, and one of them usually will be more associated with committing violent acts. So the idea of stigma, labels, we have to understand that they are out there. A lot of them are going to be culturally driven by our media and by pop culture that views disorders a certain way. Uh, it's not unusual now for people to admit that they may have gone through therapy, but it's easier now than it was 30, 40 years ago, that if you admitted to something like that, you really would be seen as someone who was weird or weak or something of that nature. But fortunately, things are changing, hopefully for the better. Now, as we stated in the little intro to this particular subsection here, we also wanted to talk about insanity and responsibility. Now, Jared Loughner shot many people, including U.S. Representative in 2011. Loughner had schizophrenia and substance abuse problems, a combination associated with increased violence. So here, schizophrenia of itself may not be a violent type of thing, but when it's put in conjunction with substance abuse, then we tend to see that combo be a very, very increased violent one. To what degree, if any, should he be held responsible for his actions? What is the appropriate consequence? So here, Loeffler, when he's 24, I went to check to see what actually did happen to this individual. He killed 6 people and wounded 13 others. He was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole. But the question is always going to be one that we'll see, or you'll see mentioned in one of my video lecture on forensic psychology a little bit later, is the idea is that this is where we see it portrayed a lot in TV and movies, where you have somebody who is legally insane, okay, or utilizing the insanity defense, which, by the way, is normally not used that much because it very, very rarely works. What they're basically saying is the person was not in their right mind when they committed a particular act. And so that's what's there, because we do know that sometimes we see there may be a tumor in someone's brain. They could have a major diagnosis going on that's very long. You can look at the medical records and see that they have been having these issues of persecution for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden, they snap or something happened. And we've seen a few instances of this over the last few weeks, I believe. But the idea here that the court and society has to make a decision about is, if we know someone has some sort of mental or psychological disorder, do we fully punish them to the fullest extent of the law, or do we cut them some slack? Okay, that is one of the things that we'll have to keep dealing with for some time, probably, unfortunately. So the idea is that we know enough that now that there are going to be potentially some mitigating circumstances for some behavior, but it does not take away from the fact that somebody's dead and somebody has lost a family member. And obviously, if you ask those family members, they're rightfully so, want their pound of flesh, so to speak. But the idea is insanity and responsibility is a major question. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, a little bit in the next session, but there's one disorder used to be referred to as multiple personality, dissociative identity disorder, where you have someone who basically has more than one personality living in a single body. If the primary person who was born with the body has a multiple personality or another alternate personality that commits a crime, well, do we put that person in jail? Because technically, if you believe in the DID diagnosis, that person, the original host of the body, the one who was born with that body, did not commit that crime. One of his alternate personalities did. So what do you do? Okay, so we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the idea is that this is why we see this type of stuff in TV and movies, entertainment so much, because it boggles the mind what the brain, the mind does here, and our questions about how as a society we want to deal with responsibilities that these people have for the acts they commit. That's a lot that I stated there, so I'm going to pause real briefly there to see if anyone wants to comment or have a question before I move on to the next topic.
I was just going to make a comment on the diagnosis of the DID. I know that we'll probably go over it later on, but I just don't understand how you can separate the identities if they literally have one body. Because to me, I feel like if that person commits the crime, like if, and obviously if they can't control that personality, that person is guilty of their crime nonetheless.
That's the way it goes down. I mean, the question about it is this, and there's a debate because it would seem almost that DID may be one of those cultural bound syndromes too. But, and there's some ideas as to what may really be going on. But if we are to believe what we see on some of the DID cases, is that somebody may be more prone to splitting, and that's why sometimes schizophrenia is confused with multiple personality or the social identity disorder because of the schiz as the splitting. But you have these
Right.
alternate personalities, and the alternate personalities have differing reactions to things that are even physiological. So regardless of whether or not it may not be seen as a real thing, at least it may be within that person's body and mind real to them. And so I guess the question is, if it is something that is real to them within that particular person's body, then that is the whole point, isn't it? That
Right.
in their mind, in their body, it is split that way, and they have this alternate personalities, and so they are fully unaware of what the other one may have done. So I mean, that's why we see this stuff in the movie so often, because it is something that makes you want to scratch your head. Now, one of the things I will say, this is not my area. I've researched it a lot, but I have not done a lot of training in this area, is that the mind is really an amazing thing, and it does a lot of things to protect itself. And even from the defense mechanisms that we saw in the previous session, uh, where you have denial, okay, and I guess from a Freudian point of view, it would make sense too. Is this an ultimate defense mechanism for someone who went through some really bad type of trauma when they were young, that they
Right.
develop these alternates to deal with it? Now, it could be something that this person is very imaginative and concocted all this type of stuff in their head, but they've conditioned themselves, and the question is, it may be real to them. And again, I guess the question is, that's the point, isn't it, to some extent, that in their mind they're sort of been able to partition it that way. But again, we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing, but also one too that I would feel, if indeed it is something where this person does truly not have any recollection. I mean, you can even go one that's even not as controversial as that. Let's say somebody committed a heinous crime, and then they got into their car and they were escaping, and then they got into a car accident, and then they got amnesia. Okay, and their amnesia is such that they don't know if it will ever return. They have no recollection of anything they did at that time. So if they have no memory, and the memory is not likely to come back, do we punish them for a crime they can't even remember? The question is tough, but the idea is that this is the type of thing that people are paid money to try to figure out, you know.
Yeah.
but the idea is that when it comes to the stuff that's going on in someone's head, it's very difficult. I mean, that's one of the reasons too that we suggested previously why young people are not held to the fullest extent of the law for some of the times, some of the crimes they may commit, because we know from our research as psychologists that that frontal lobe has not fully engaged yet. Therefore, they are more likely to engage in risky behavior that if you're a little bit older, your inhibition circuits would have kicked in and you would have prevented yourself from doing it. So we know this type of stuff now, and because of this stuff that we know, the question of responsibility has a question mark behind it. How responsible do we hold these individuals? All right.
I see.
Okay. All right. So now let's look at the psychological disorders themselves. We'll start off by looking at our friend anxiety. We'll look at generalized panic, phobias, OCD, PTSD, and look at some of the causes of these anxiety disorders as well. So we start off by looking at generalized anxiety disorder. An emotional cognitive symptoms including worrying, having anxious feelings and thoughts about many subjects, and sometimes this free floating anxiety with no attachment to any subject. You're just anxious. You have this anxious anticipation, and it interferes with concentration. It's like you're walking around all day with this big axe hanging over your head, about ready to drop at any moment, and you can't escape it. All right. The physical symptoms include autonomic arousal, trembling, sweating, fidgeting, agitation, and sleep disruption. Now, I don't know if you're unlucky to have experienced this type of stuff, but when you have it, it's tough to do a lot of things. You're always sort of like on edge. Anything's about ready to snap. You just feel this impending doom that you know is coming your way. That is what we mean by this generalized anxiety disorder. It's not associated with any particular thing, or it can be associated with a bunch of things. It's sort of free floating. You just know this dark cloud is falling over you. And then we have the panic disorder, the sense that I'm dying. A panic attack is not just an anxiety attack. It may include many minutes of intense dread or terror, chest pains, choking, numbness, or other frightening physical sensations. It may mimic sometimes like you're having a heart attack, a feeling of need to escape. Panic disorders refers to repeated and unexpected panic attacks, as well as the fear of the next attack. I went through a long part of my life without having one of these until I did. And it was not a pleasant thing whatsoever. All of a sudden, now the blue, I'm in the back seat of a car and I have this major panic attack. Literally had to tell the person to pull over to the side of the road as I stumbled to get out of the car, where I was feeling like things were coming, closing in on me. Now, once that happens, a whole other things happen here too. Because once you have a panic attack, and again, some of you may have gone through this, once you've had a panic attack, there's always going to be a little bit of a worry about the next attack. Will I have this attack when I go on this job interview? Will I have it when I get into this elevator? Whatever the case, what it comes down to. But it's sort of like it sort of feeds into itself. So panic attacks are a real thing, and they are sometimes very, very frightening. Well, always when you have the attack itself. But the mind feels in an explanation, I'm feeling terror, and the physical response to a threat. There must be some danger here. People sometimes attribute the panic to whatever situation they're in. So it can be just happening, and you have to figure out why it may be happening, but you do have it. Has anybody have any familiarity with at all with someone or personally with having panic attacks? It is not a pleasant thing to go through, but once you have one, you'll sort of know it when you have it, because of it really leaves a mark, so to speak. So these are all related to anxiety. Anxiety, this sense of doom that's going on here, or a great deal of fear and panicky notions. Now, sometimes we have specific phobias. A specific phobia is more than just a strong fear or dislike. A specific phobia is diagnosed when there is an uncontrollable, irrational, intense desire to avoid the same object or situation. So this is a fear well out of proportion to the object itself. So it's uncontrollable and irrational and intense. It goes beyond the pale, so to speak. Even an image of the object can trigger a reaction. Get it away from me. All right. So the uncontrollable, irrational, intense desire to avoid the object or the phobia. Now, normally when it comes to types of disorders out there, a lot of people may have a phobia to something, but they don't necessarily seek assistance to deal with the phobia, because most of the phobias that they may have, they have a life in which they can avoid those phobias, just avoid those things that cause this great deal of threat. Now, when it comes to irrational, it means the fear and the avoidance compulsion are out of proportion to the actual threat. And the phobia occurs even when the person knows the fear doesn't make sense. Logic has nothing to do with it. You're simply going to be afraid or terrified of it. Now, I even though I have it up here, does anybody know anybody who has a fear of clowns? I will be honest with you, I'm not comfortable around them. I don't know why that is. There is a disorder Now, I think there is a name for the particular phobia. Does anyone know what the name of the phobia is for a fear of clowns? Anyone? I think it's called color. What is it? I'll figure it out in a second. But the idea is that we have all these fears here, these phobias, and these phobias can be totally irrational, but they do have a great deal of impact on them. You have claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. So we see all these types of phobias there, and they can be very present in someone's life. So which of varies more, fear or phobias? What does this imply? Some other phobias, we have agoraphobia, the avoidance of situations in which one will fear having a panic attack. So you're out in situations. We have social phobia, an intense fear of being watched and judged by others, showing as a fear, possibly embarrassing public types of situations. A color, I think it's called colorophobia. Colorophobia, I think, is what is the fear of clowns, I believe. So we see here, we can compare the fear versus the phobia. So we can see there's a lot more fears out there. The phobias, again, are going to be the irrational, intense, way out of proportion, scary, spooky, terrifying feelings that you get for something. So being alone, storms, all sorts of fears and all sorts of phobias associated with them. Now, another aspect of anxiety disorder is also obsessive compulsive disorder, referred to oftentimes as OCD. I'm sure you've heard of this one before as well. This is one too that normally is on talk shows. I don't know if talk shows are really still a thing in the afternoon anymore, but a few decades ago it was, and oftentimes one of the topics would be OCD, that have people there with their various OCD symptoms that they have, what they have obsessions and compulsions about. Obsessions are intense, unwanted worries, ideas, and images that repeatedly pop up in the mind. All right. And a compulsion is a repeatedly strong feeling of needing to carry out an action, even though it doesn't feel like it makes any sense. So, why is OCD considered an anxiety disorder? Because obsessions can be a distraction from underlying anxiety. So the obsession is a distraction, used sort of like as a defense mechanism in a sort sense, a distraction from anxiety, and compulsions worsen through a cycle of negative reinforcement related to the anxiety. The OCD suffers, resists carrying out the compulsion, feels anxious, and ultimately relieves the anxiety by giving in to the compulsion, thus reinforcing it. Again, remember all these things that we've talked about before in previous chapters, they still are quite legitimate. We can see how they all sort of tie together here as well. So when is it a disorder? Distress when you are deeply frustrated with not being able to control the behaviors. So the disorder is controlling you, you're doing a behavior and you don't feel like you're in control anymore, or a dysfunction when the time and mental energy spent on these thoughts and behaviors interfere with everyday life. For example, one of the common OCD things deals with the compulsion to wash hands. If you are washing your hands 200-300 times a day, you have very little time to do other things. Not to mention washing your hands that often probably will cause some degree of damage as well. We all do experience some obsessive or compulsive types of things sometimes, and these things happen every day. So it's not unusual for us to be a little bit of OCD. In fact, a little bit of OCD may be helpful to some regard because it can help you to focus on something. So the percentage of children and adolescents with OCD reporting these obsessions or compulsions are this: thought or behavior. Obsessions, these are repetitive thoughts. Okay, 40% concerned with dirt, germs, or toxins. 24% something terrible is going to happen, fire, death, or illness. 17% symmetry, order, or exactness. So this is going to be that small slice of the population of this particular obsessive group where things must be squared away. Things must be aligned. It must be at right angles to each other, those types of things. And then we have the compulsions, the repeated behaviors, excessive hand washing, 85%, repeated rituals in or out of a door, up or down from a chair, 51%. And then one that we all can sort of relate to, I'm sure we can, checking doors, locks, appliances, cars, brakes, and homework repeatedly. So if you're working on some sort of formula for a class and you've solved it, and yet you've checked it 3 times and then 4 times, it could be a mistake you're looking for, or it could be just a little bit of a compulsion coming out. Now, if you wake up in the middle of the night after you've gone and checked all your locks and the doors and all this type of stuff, do you go check them again once you wake up? Okay, so a common pattern of rechecking, although you know that you've already made sure the door is locked, you feel you must check it again and again. So it's sort of like a little ritual type of thing that has popped up. And so we do see this type of behavior from time to time. But with these individuals, where it becomes a disorder, it is way, way out of proportion. It's something that they have to do. Sometimes you can see people who may walk into a room and flip a light switch 3 times, or some other type of thing too, which may be sort of a type of behavior that they have to do in order to feel the anxiety get released. One of my closest friends when I was in graduate school was someone who was very much into symmetry, order, or exactness. In fact, I remember we were going out to a party or something. I went by, swinging by his place to pick him up, and he was in the back, and I was looking at his bookshelf. I took one of his books, read a little few pages in it, closed it, and put it someplace else. Okay, he's in the back of the apartment, and then we're ready to go. He's walking out. It's like the book had some sort of tendril or something. As he walked past the bookcase, he sort of stopped, turned, and saw that the book was out of place, and went over there and put it back. Everything was fine then. Symmetry, order, and exactness. All right, I'm going to pause there real quickly to see if anyone has any comments or questions before we move on to the next topic, PTSD. Anyone, comments or questions? Okay, cool. Let's keep moving then. So the next anxiety disorder is one that I'm sure some of you may be familiar with, PTSD, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder. About 10 to 35% of people who experience trauma not only have burned in memories, like those flashbulb memories we talked about in previous session, but also 4 weeks, which is a time frame, to a lifetime of repeated intrusive recall of those memories, nightmares and other re-experiencing, social withdrawal or phobic avoidance, and jumpy anxiety or hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is basically you're always on edge. You're ready for something to bust through the door. You're on guard. It's like that. It's like your fight or flight response is stuck on or on red alert. You're ready to go, okay? Because something's about ready to happen. Now, so PTSD is not just an outcome of war experience. Overwhelming trauma happens to people in all walks of life. And why is PTSD classified as anxiety disorder? The overall experience may look like spacey withdrawal or occasional jumpiness from the outside. However, inside there is tension, turmoil, worry, fear, dread, angst, and reliving the feelings of the trauma itself, which is likely to be anxiety and related reactions to threat. So again, you look at someone and you see sort of like the blankness of the face, but the blankness of face belies what is going on inside the person, where it's almost like a storm of a sense. So obviously, PTSD is something that we've seen be on the rise as more people have been put in situations, in combat situations. But again, I've known of people who have developed PTSD based on a really, really bad car accident. Okay, one of those car accidents where the car flips over a few times and crash lands, and that's a trauma. Okay, and you can have the same type of experiences that a soldier may have experienced with a really close call during a shootout or an IED incident. So the idea here is that anyone can go through these types of experiences that can result in a PTSD. So, and of course, one of the key things too that we see is that you may have problems with sleep, insomnia, or staying asleep, or even getting to sleep. These are part and parcel of what we normally see with these types of anxiety issues. All right, so those with sensitive emotion producing limbic system are the people who are likely to develop PTSD, those who are asked to relive their trauma as they report it, and those previously traumatized are those who are more likely to develop PTSD. Now, understanding anxiety disorders. Why do we have these? Explanations from different perspectives. All right, genes, there may be some genes that predispose us to some fears. We have cognitive conditioning, overgeneralizing a conditioned response like what we saw in little Albert. Operant conditioning, rewarding avoidance. The brain active anxiety pathways that may exist in the brain. Cognitive appraisals, uncertainty is a danger. When you can't appraise what is going on, that represents a danger. And then natural selection, surviving by avoiding danger. All of these are perspectives that could show to us why it is that we can understand a little bit more about these anxiety disorders. So real quickly, let's go over a couple of these real quickly here. We have in the experiment by Watson, 1920, little Albert learned to feel fear around a rabbit because he had been conditioned to associate the bunny with a loud, scary noise. Sometimes such a conditioned response becomes overgeneralized, and we may begin to feel fear for animals, everything fluffy, and all experimenters. This results is a phobia or a generalized anxiety. So that's how that may come about. How about operant conditioning and anxiety? We may feel anxious in a situation and make a decision to leave. This makes us feel better, and our anxious avoidance was just reinforced. So we take away something that's unpleasant. By doing that, we take it away, and that behavior has just been reinforced. If we know we have locked a door but feel anxious and compelled to recheck, rechecking will help us temporarily feel better. Therefore, that behavior gets reinforced. All right. So the result is that increased anxious thoughts and behaviors. So it sort of builds on itself. We also have observational learning. Experiments with humans and monkeys show that anxiety can be acquired through observational learning. If you see someone else avoiding or fearing some object or creature, you might pick up that fear and adopt it even after the original scared person is not around anymore. All right. So in this way, fears get passed down families. So think about it this way. Your family or members of your family has a fear to something. Let's say X. Members of your family have a fear to X. As a kid, you're growing up, you see a member of your family or members of your family respond in fearful ways to X. You, through observational learning and anxiety, in turn become anxious to seeing X and learn to fear it. And when you have kids, you do the same thing. So the idea is that observational learning and anxiety, we see the following. In fact, this has been thought of as a way to explain the acquisition of prejudice. Subtle behaviors like avoiding certain types of people on a dark street may be acquired through watching the behavior of parents and friends, even when espouse believing in equal treatment and worth of all groups. It's not what you say, it is what you do and how you behave around X or whatever group that may represent. So the young person learns that. I remember a few years ago, I was in Florida walking on a sidewalk, walking toward a mother and her child. And I remember the lady takes her purse from the left side and puts it on the right side as I passed by her. Okay, so the idea, very subtle, but the notion is, well, what does that say? Okay, the idea is that it can be a very teaching moment for the kid that was with her. Okay, when it comes to observational learning and anxiety and how that fear may be passed down. All right, I'll pause there real quick to see if there are any questions or comments. Okay. All right. So cognition and anxiety. Cognition includes worried thoughts as well as interpretations, appraisals, beliefs, and predictions, and ruminations. We just go over something over and over and over and over. It's like you keep chewing on it. Cognition includes mental habits such as hypervigilance, persistently watching out for danger. You're on red alert. This accompanies anxiety and PTSD. All right. So, and anxiety disorders such as cognitions appear repeatedly and make anxiety worse. So, cognition kicks in to make it worse as you are on red alert and you're always thinking about it, predicting the bad stuff is going to happen. It just causes this particularly very painful type of cycle that goes on. So, biology and anxiety genes. Studies show that identical twins, even raised separately, develop similar phobias, more similar than two unrelated people. Some people seem to have an inborn high strong temperament, while others are more easygoing. We've talked about temperament before. We believe that is something that we are born with, the easygoing or the high strong one. Temperament may be encoded in our genes. Now, genes and neurotransmitters. Genes regulate the levels of neurotransmitters. We've talked about that before. People with anxiety have problems with a gene associated with levels of serotonin, a neurotransmitter involved in regulating sleep and mood. People with anxiety also have a gene that triggers high levels of glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in the brain's alarm systems. So again, as we've referred to several times, for example, when we talk about someone who may be somewhat shy, it could simply be that their alarm system is too easily triggered. So people with anxiety also have a gene that triggers this glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in the brain's alarm centers. And you want to try to calm that stuff down. Therefore, you try to avoid those things which trigger the alarm system. Now, traumatic experiences can burn fear circuits into the amygdala. These circuits are later triggered and activated. Anxiety disorders include over-arousal of brain areas involved in impulse control and habitual behaviors. Again, you can see where the OCD may be able to come in there. So this is the brain of an OCD. The OCD brain shows extra activity, okay, in the ACC, which monitors our actions and checks for errors. So that's the area of the brain that does that. And so we can see here in the OCD, the anterior cingulate gyrus here is active, the extra activity here. So we can see that this OCD is sort of brain deep, that there is something literally going on in the brain that is responsible for the symptomology of the particular psychological disorder. Now, biology and anxiety, an evolutionary perspective. So evolutionary psychology question, why is anxiety part of our biological repertoire? Why do we have the ability to be anxious? Well, they state that perhaps panic, when functioning as fight, flight, or freeze, helped our ancestors stay safe when encountering danger. Perhaps worrying helps us plan how to face future danger. So at a certain level, the anxiety and worry may help us to survive. So the book suggests that compulsions are exaggerations of natural survival strategies. For example, hair pulling stems from grooming, rechecking stems from territory management, and compulsive washing stems from healthy practice. Now, look at what we have here. One, human phobic objects. These are things which we as human beings are sort of programmed to have as phobias. Okay, we might not have them totally phobic into everybody, but we are sort of pre-programmed. We can easily or develop these type of phobias. Snakes, heights, closed spaces, and darkness. The idea is that these most likely probably serve some sort of survival function. because similar but non-phobic objects, for example, we don't see people who are phobic of fish or low places or open spaces or bright light. So those things did not provide danger. All right. Dangerous yet not phobic subjects, for example, we are likely to become cautious about, but not phobic about guns, electric wiring, and cars. Now, this is the explanation coming up here. Evolutionary psychologists believe that ancestors prone to fear the items on list number 1 were less likely to die before reproducing. So those who had a healthy respect or fear for snakes, heights, closed spaces, and darkness, they survived. Therefore, when they had offspring, those offspring were more likely to have those particular items on their list as well. And so when it comes to item number 3, there has not been time for the innate fear of list in number 3, the gun list, to spread into the population. So the idea is given enough time and rationale, it could. But right now we're still at snakes, heights, closed spaces, and darkness. That it aided us in surviving in the past, and that's why we see all these people with phobias based on those particular objects. All right, so that wraps up anxiety. I want to go at least touch base real quickly here on mood, psychological disorders. We'll be looking at major depressive disorder, stuck in dark withdrawal, bipolar disorder, the prevalence and course of depression, genetic influences, suicide and self-injury, negative moods, and the vicious cycle. We'll talk more about what that is as well. So what is a mood disorder? Major depressive disorder, MDD, is more than just feeling down. It's more than just feeling sad about something. And bipolar disorder is more than mood swings. It's depression plus the problematic overlay up mood called mania. So let's talk real briefly here about what the criteria for major depressive disorders are. Major depressive disorder is not just one of these symptoms. It is one or both of the first two, plus 3 or more of the rest. So it's either going to be depressed mood most of the day and or markedly diminished interest or pleasure in activities, and 3 or more of the following: significant increase or decrease in appetite or weight, insomnia, lethargy, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, daily problems in thinking, or recurring thoughts of death or suicide. So again, one or both of the first two, and then the idea of 2 or 3 of the rest. Now, depression is something that we see everywhere. It shows up in people seeking treatment. Phobias are the most common, frequently experienced disorder, but depression is the #1 reason people seek mental health services. Depression appears worldwide. Per year, depressive episodes happen to about 6% of men and about 9% of women. Over the course of a lifetime, 12% of Canadians and 17% of USA residents experience depression. Over the course of a lifetime, 12% of Canadians and 17% of USA residents experience depression. So depression is something that we see out there. It is global. As I stated earlier, schizophrenia and depression seem to be something that is around the world, unlike those culturally bound syndromes that we saw earlier. So the idea here is that depression is something that we see a lot out in our own lives. People most likely are taking some SSRI to sort of manage some sort of depressive situation they may be having going on here. In addition, I want to end up talking about this last slide here about the seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. Seasonal affective disorder is more than simply disliking winter. Seasonal affective disorder involves a recurring seasonal pattern of depression, usually during winter's short, dark, cold days. Most of you probably have some familiarity with this because you know how it is when the time changes, the weather's cold out there. And one way to just demonstrate how this has an impact on us, they can have a simple survey, have you cried today survey. Have you cried today? The results, more people answer yes in the winter. So we have August, okay, and December being the winter months. And we asked men, we have 4% say yes, they have cried, 8% in December say they have cried. But look at it for women, we see 7% in August and 21%. So there's an increase on both men and women crying. Have you cried today? Questionnaire. So the notion here is that the seasons do affect our mood. Okay, and so we'll see a little bit more about this when we get back here in our next session. So are there any questions or comments now before we end today? Questions, comments? Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. I will see you on Thursday as we wrap things up. You guys take care.